Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I am going to show you how to count stitches for the 4 basic crochet stitches. Now this is not a very sexy topic at all whenever it comes to crochet. There are so many more fun things to talk about, but this is a fundamental whenever it comes to crocheting. You have to be able to determine what a stitch looks like, and you have to be able to count it, because if you can't count your stitches, well, chances are you are, at least in the beginning, you will be off if you don't count them, which means your piece can grow and become much bigger than you intend, or it can actually shrink and start curling up because you didn't add enough stitches. So this topic is very important for any crocheter, beginner to expert. Now, I know that I struggled with this whenever I was a beginner, and that was like over 10 years ago now, whenever I started crocheting. And like I said, this is a topic that I struggled with, but it also was brought to my attention whenever I was teaching my dad to crochet a few months ago. Now that was a fun experience, and that's a video for another time, but it was a very humbling experience. I've been crocheting for years, and my dad had just picked up a crochet hook and some yarn, and so I had to go back and really make sense of it for my dad, and counting stitches was one of those things that I had to work on. So I have created this video for you guys. I hope to clear up any questions that you may have about counting stitches. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm just gonna switch the camera angle so that you can see my swatches, and I will show you exactly how to count them for the 4 basic crochet stitches. The 4 basic crochet stitches that are used in this video include the single crochet, the half double crochet, the double crochet, and the treble crochet. Now I am using the US terms for these stitches, so if you need to, just see the description box below for the link to the other terms for these stitches. There are 2 main methods that I like to use to count the number of stitches for crochet. The first method is by counting the top of the stitches of the last row created. Now I like this method because it applies to all 4 of the stitches that I show you. The top of every stitch looks the exact same. So let me show you what this looks like. Now I just grabbed a random swatch out of the 4 that I have here, and this one looks like it is the single crochet. Well, if you notice here at the top, there are a row of what looks like sideways V's, or almost like a greater than sign. And this is what you count. So each sideways V counts as 1 stitch. Now let's go ahead and count these. I'm going to start from left to right. So here is that first V, so this counts as 1. We have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So there's a total of 13 stitches in this single crochet swatch. Now I want to grab the treble crochet swatch because I actually just thought of this, but you should be a little more cautious with the stitches with bigger heights, such as the treble crochet and the double crochet. And why I say that you should be cautious is because you need to know if the turning chain counts as a stitch. If it does count, all this means is that once you make the turning chain, like what I'm pointing at here, you skip the first stitch and crochet into the second. So there is a small gap, and you can see the stitch was skipped here. But since the turning chain counts as a stitch, you will end up with the same number of stitches every time. And I recently published a video on turning chains, and I cover all of this information and more. So I'll put up a card on the top right section if you need to review this topic. But it is important for you to know this when you're crocheting, because as I said, the number of stitches will differ if you forget to count it. With that said, let's get into actually counting the number of stitches for the treble crochet. Just keep in mind that I am counting the turning chain as a stitch. Again, I am going to count from left to right, so I will start over here, and we're looking for those sideways V's again. So here's our first one. Here's 1, There's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and this is what I was talking about, the turning chain counting as a stitch. This top V of the turning chain counts as the 14th stitch. So there are 14 stitches total in this swatch of treble crochets. And this concludes method number 1. Method number 2 is to count the stitches themselves. What I mean by that is every stitch creates a knot, or let's call it a post. And the posts, or the stitches, are connected by the tops, not the sides. So if you pull the fabric apart, you'll be able to see gaps in the fabric. And the posts, aka stitches, are on either side of the gaps, making it easy to count them. And this goes for all 4 of the stitches covered in this video. I like to use this method whenever I need to go back a couple rows to make sure that the stitch counts are the same. This allows me to find the problem before I just start ripping out stitches. And I must say, this method does work better for the bigger stitches, such as the double crochet and the treble crochet. And this is because their posts are much bigger and easier to spot, therefore easier to count. However, this does still work for smaller stitches. And if you follow the tips that I have for you, the single crochet and the half double crochet will be just as easy to count as those bigger stitches. I want to start with the hardest stitch to count, at least in my opinion, and that is the single crochet. Let's first look at the structure of the stitch. Now take a moment and really look at the fabric. Now what are your eyes drawn to? Mine are drawn to the small dashes that run across the fabric. And if you look closer, the dashes look more like the Greek symbol pi, and each pi represents 1 stitch. But before we jump in and just start counting the stitches in this row, I want to go back to the top of the swatch to show you a more detailed look of the single crochet stitch, because if you look here, the first part of the row is a little tricky. It doesn't look like a pie, so does this stitch count or not? So as you can see here, I did alternate the colors on the top rows so that it makes it easier to see the structure of each stitch, but also easier to count the rows, which will be covered in a separate video. But this first row of white has the pie symbol that I was referring to earlier. This is actually the back of the single crochet stitch. And on the row above that is tan, you can see that the front of the single crochet looks like small V's. But if I flip the swatch over, the rows switch. The row of white has the V looking stitches, and the row of tan has the pie symbol stitches. Again, this is just because when you crochet back and forth, you actually switch directions, so the fronts and backs alternate every other row. It's easy to count the V's here because of the color difference. However, this is where my first tip comes into play. You need to look for the pie symbols and count those for the single crochet. Because if you move down to the rows that are the same color, which is where we started at, the V's blend in and are much harder to count. So I think I have probably bored you enough, so let's go ahead and count the row of the white single crochets, and I will be starting from left to right. This first stitch, if you remember, didn't look like a pie symbol, so we weren't really sure whether or not it counted. But looking at it here, you can see that it is the first stitch, and in fact does look a bit like a pie symbol. So this counts as our first stitch. So let's keep going. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So there are a total of 13 stitches in this swatch of single crochets. Well, now let's go ahead and jump back down to the middle of the swatch where the rows are the same color. This first part doesn't look like a pie symbol, but remember, it does count as a stitch. So here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So we got the same exact number of stitches in this row as we did in the white row, which is exactly what we should get because there are 13 stitches in every row on the swatch. So this concludes how to count the single crochet, and let's move on to how to count the half double crochet. We'll tackle this stitch in the same manner as we did the single crochet, because while this one is easier to count, it can still be tricky at times. Let's look at this fabric. So notice the stitches look much different and the posts are bigger than the single crochet. And I don't know about you, but my eye is always drawn to this twisted line. However, the line is difficult to count. But if you look above or below, you'll notice what looks like V's. And this is what you want to count. So like I did previously, let's look at the rows with alternating colors because it is easier to see the stitches at first. Now this first row of white stitches represents the back of the half double crochet, and this is where the twisted line goes through the middle of the stitch. Underneath the line is where you see the V's that I was talking about with the stitches down here. Now if you go to the row above with the tan colored stitches, you can see that the stitch looks different, but there are the similar V's that represent each stitch. And if we flip the fabric over, we get the opposite looks just as we did for the single crochet. So I think that's enough of looking at this fabric, so let's just start counting. And when it comes to counting the half double crochet, my second tip is to count the V's in each row. So let's start with this white row. Oh, and I should mention that when I made this swatch, I did count the turning chain as a stitch, so it's going to seem a bit tricky when we count, but I will try my best to make sense of it for you. So right here is the chain stitch. Now, it does not look like a V that we saw previously, but it does count as a stitch. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and we have one more stitch that's hiding behind here that was made into that turning chain. Now it looks like 2 stitches were made into one, but if you pull it apart here, you'll be able to see that the 14th stitch is standalone and it was just made into that last turning chain. So we have a total of 14 half double crochet stitches on this row. Now if you choose to count from the front of the stitch, this is how it would go. This first one was made into the chain, so this one counts as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And I have to pull this up, but this turning chain counts as the 14th stitch. So I think that you get the picture by now, but I want to make sure that you can count these stitches from the front and the back. So let's just jump to the middle of the swatch and choose a random row, and let's just count here. Now here's that twisted line, and remember we're looking for the V's below that. So the turning chain does count as a stitch for this one, so it doesn't quite look like a V, but this does count as 1. We have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and don't forget to count that 14th stitch, which is made into that last turning chain. So there you have it. That is how you count the half double crochet. And let's go ahead and move on to the next stitch, which is the double crochet. The double crochet stitches are much easier to count compared to the half double crochet and the single crochet. So let's just go ahead and look at its stitch structure. The gaps are bigger in this swatch because the double crochet has bigger posts, or in other words, the height of the stitch is taller. So looking at the stitches in each row, you can't tell much of a difference between the fronts and backs. I will point them out just so that you know, but it won't make a difference when we count the stitches. So this white row represents the front of the stitch, and the tan row represents the back. Like I said, not a huge difference, but it's good to know anyway. So how do we count the double crochet? Easy, just count each post as one stitch. Now the turning chains that are along the side count as a stitch, but I don't think you'll have any problem spotting them, so let's just jump in and count. We can start with this row of white stitches as we have done for the previous 2 stitches. So this counts as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and this turning chain counts as number 14. Well, let's do this counting one last time in the middle of the swatch. It's easy to see all of these stitches here, but I must be consistent and show you before we move along. So here's the first stitch, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and we have 14. Well, I have a feeling that you won't have any problems counting the double crochet. Just remember to count that turning chain as a stitch. And we can move on to the final stitch of this video, which is the treble crochet. So here's my swatch of treble crochets, and you can immediately see that these stitches have even longer posts than the double crochet. So there are much bigger gaps between the stitches, which means that these are much easier to count. So let's talk for a moment about the stitches. This white row represents the front of the treble crochet, and the tan row represents the back of the stitch. Not a big difference, but again, it is good to point out just in case you need it for future use. So let's get to counting this one. We'll start with the white row. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Well, you probably didn't notice, but number 14 was actually a turning chain. And if you look closely, it does look a little different. It doesn't have that little V at the bottom of it, but it's easy to count. It looks just like one of the treble crochet stitches. So again, I don't think that you will have any issues with counting the stitches in the middle of this swatch, but to keep things consistent, I'll show you one last time down here. So this time, the turning chain is actually at the beginning of this row. So this counts as 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Well, that concludes how to count the treble crochet stitch. So counting crochet stitches is not hard once you understand the stitch structure. So I hope that that was clear in this video, and I want to thank you so much for joining me. And if you found this video helpful, do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want more crochet tips. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.